The case today is Fischer versus Department of Justice. And again, this is a case which could have serious implications on Jack Smith's case against President Trump out of Washington, D.C. So Fischer versus the United States. Fischer was one of the people who did enter the Capitol. He was charged with a number of crimes, 7 different counts, but he is challenging one of those counts, and that is obstruction of an official proceeding under Section 18 of the U.S. Code 1512. And that's because there's a debate that goes back and forth between even courts now, the district court, which agreed with Fischer, the appellate court, which did not, which said that when you're talking about that code provision, that criminal code provision, you're actually talking about tampering with evidence. You're not talking about tampering with a actual procedure, like they had to, slow down to have their procedural vote on the Electoral College counting. You're actually talking about tampering with evidence. And so there's this disagreement between the district court and the Court of Appeals. It's very significant that the Supreme Court has decided now to take this case up. And here's why. President Trump, unlike Fischer, who was charged with 7 different counts, and he's only challenging one is unconstitutional, President Trump was charged with 4, but 2 of those fall under this category. So if you erase those 2 of the 4 charges from Jack Smith, which are the conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding and the obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, all you're left with is very generic, which the Supreme Court and federal courts don't love, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., how? And then conspiracy against rights, whose? So that's all Jack Smith would be left with, Logan, if Fischer is successful in this challenge. And I will say this. Usually you would say with these defendants who are usually found guilty, when they pick out one that they want to challenge in court, the fact that it's made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court means there's at least 4 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court who believe that the Court of Appeals is wrong and they're overbroad in their interpretation.
I think we need to kind of clear that up so people understand that. To get accepted, for this to happen, it's not like, you just work your way up.
No.
You work your way up to a certain point, and then they make the decision whether they want to hear it.
Right. If the majority of the Supreme Court, I'd say 4 of the Supreme Court justices at least, felt like this was 100%, that they were right at the Court of Appeals level, that it is broader than just actually going in and tampering with evidence, they weren't going to take their time to take another case high profile with President Trump involved because of how it would affect his January 6th case. But they have decided to. They're doing it today as we speak. And the ramifications are gigantic, because if the court finds that those charges are wrong, that they cannot be used in this context, then you can argue that with President Trump that they also are wrong and cannot be used in this context, which takes Jack Smith's case from 4 charges down to 2, and it takes his 2 strongest charges, the conspiracy to obstruct an official government proceeding, which is the counting of those electoral votes, takes those out, and you're left with some pretty weak federal charges, which, again, we can't predict where the Supreme Court's going on it. But what we do know, Logan, is that they were not satisfied with where the Court of Appeals came down on this. So that's huge.
Yep, let's go ahead and take a phone call related to it. Let's go to Ralph, who's calling in Louisiana, listening on the radio. On line 2, Ralph, you're on the air.
Yeah, I happen to be a human being, and if people come and try and attack me, just like those justices on the Supreme Court, they are human beings too. When you show up to someone's house and you try and do their family harm, if they're a judge, do you honestly think you can stand before them and get a favorable ruling anytime after that? I dare say that they will ever see a favorable ruling again in the Supreme Court of the United States, because they have unwittingly biased the judges by going to their homes and trying to attack them and stuff.
We obviously saw that a lot. And Ralph, thank you also for clarifying that you're a human being. I think that is something that we need to make sure our callers, not extraterrestrials. We appreciate it, Ralph. But
that's with Brett Kavanaugh. I will tell you, these judges go to great extent when they get into those chambers to divorce that personal life from
that's how they make it there,
from the law. And that is how they make it there. They make it there by having that ability to do that, by taking their personal biases and putting it aside. Now, does that always mean that it won't inform them, of course, how they grew up, how they live, and experiences they have? No. And of course not. Like, I think you're right to an extent that, like, that's going to help, that's going to also come into play. But when they interpret laws about, is it a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding by just going in and shouting, or did you have to actually tamper with some kind of evidence? That's pretty cut or dry if you believe one or the other. And then I don't think you have to get into the violence so much or the knocking down doors. You just say, is it enough to go in there and scream and shout and where they have to delay it? Or does it take another step, a step where you're actually, again, are tampering with legal evidence to try and obstruct an official proceeding? And that's the issue up before the U.S. Supreme Court today, and it will have huge ramifications on Jack Smith's case against President Trump out of the D.C. Prosecution. I always almost call it persecution, but prosecution out of D.C. Because that one, again, is going to be looking clearly at where the Supreme Court comes down, because 2 of the 4 charges against President Trump are charges related to this section of the U.S. Code.